When there are situations that are difficult or hard, or there are trials in our lives, oftentimes we feel like we have to succumb to those things, but we should be reminded that God can overcome all things. Well, this morning we are going to continue on in our series, Committed to God. This morning we are in Daniel chapter 8. Title of the message is Another Dream, God's Reminder. If you think about reminders, oftentimes, especially in nowadays, where there's so much technology available to us, that we have constant reminders. I remember when my wife and I, and really our family, we started utilizing Google calendars. And I remember my wife had to remind us, hey, put things on the calendar. And I think she still does that today, but put things on the calendar to remind us of events and things that we have commitments for the upcoming week and into the future. And so every once in a while, when you check your calendar, you'll see, oh, we have this event that's coming up, or there's something that we have committed ourselves to. You think about even today, many companies utilize reminders to remind their customers of things that are coming up, that, you know, there might be a sale or there's something that you have subscribed to. You think about, for example, Amazon. Amazon has their subscribe and save. And so every once in a while, you will get a reminder that, hey, your packages for your subscribe and save are coming this week or in the upcoming weeks. Our family also utilizes a company called ButcherBox, which delivers meat. And I just actually received a note or a reminder that, hey, ButcherBox is coming soon. And so there's all kinds of reminders that we have in our lives. Well, in Daniel chapter 8, as Daniel receives this dream, this vision from the Lord, it's a reminder to him of God's sovereignty. Oftentimes we can kind of forget, as we're going through our day-to-day lives, as things happen on a regular basis to us, we can forget that God is still sovereign. When there are situations that are difficult or hard, or there are trials in our lives, oftentimes we feel like we have to succumb to those things, but we should be reminded that God can overcome all things, even the things that we see as difficult or challenging. And so that's what we see here in Daniel chapter 8, that God is going to provide Daniel another dream, but God is going to remind Daniel that he is still God and that he is still sovereign. And so Daniel chapter 8 is where we're going to begin our message this morning. Now, before we actually get into the text, I want to remind us of a couple of things. First and foremost, just the structure of this prophetical book. If you look at the first 6 chapters, chapters 1 through 6 in this book, Daniel frequently is receiving information from others about their dreams, about their visions, and Daniel is called upon to interpret those dreams. But here, as we got to Daniel chapter 7, which we covered last week, but in Daniel chapter 7 and now in Daniel chapter 8, Daniel is going to receive his own dreams and visions. And he is unable to interpret those dreams himself. And so he requires interpretation from others so that he might understand the dreams or the visions he has. And we need to understand just the progression from the very first dream in Daniel chapter 7 to this dream here in Daniel chapter 8. His first dream that was recorded in chapter 7 occurred during the first year of King Belshazzar. Now, King Belshazzar wasn't necessarily the king. He was really more of a regent. It was his father who was truly the king. But since Belshazzar was the one who was reigning at that point in time, Daniel notes him as the king. And so Daniel's first dream happened during the first year of King Belshazzar's reign. In chapter 8, we find ourselves 2 years later in the third year of King Belshazzar's reign, and Daniel experiences his second dream. And what we'll find is this, that the dream that he has here in chapter 8 is very similar to the dream that he has in the 7th chapter. There is this vision of beasts or animals. Now, these animals were not literally animals, but they were representations of earthly kingdoms that would present themselves at later points in history. Now, if you think about the kind of the history of Daniel and what he's experienced, remember Daniel was deported from his home in Israel during the Babylonian conquest. That was the first kingdom that was noted in chapter 7. Babylon reigned during that time, and they came to Israel and they conquered Israel. And so they deported many of the young men, and they took them from their homeland in Israel, and then they took them to Babylon. And so that's what happened to Daniel. And Daniel was a young man. He was in his mid-teens at that point in time. Now, the second dream that Daniel had happened around 550 BC. And so Daniel was transported around 606 BC. Now it is 56 years later, approximately. So Daniel would have been around 70 years of age. He was an older man. He was an elder at that point in time. But God was still speaking to Daniel. He was speaking to Daniel about the future and what is to come, things that are coming onto the horizon. Now, as we go through Daniel chapter 8, I'm going to read through the first part of the text, verses 1 through 14. Not much analysis is going to be done there, because on the back end, that's where we receive the interpretation. And so I'll spend more time there. But as we're going through this first part, stay with me. Don't check out. Stay with me and listen to what is stated. And then we'll talk about what the back end or the interpretation means. So in Daniel chapter 8, verse 1, it states this: in the third year of the reign of Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that had appeared to me at first. Verse 2, and in the vision I was looking, I saw myself in Susa, the capital in the province of Elam, and I was by the river Ulai. I looked up and saw a ram standing beside the river. It had two horns. Both horns were long, but one was longer than the other, and the longer one came up second. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. All beasts were powerless to withstand it, and no one could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased, and it became strong. Now, let me stop there. Now, I indicated I wasn't going to give much analysis, but I am going to talk about this really quickly here. So, Daniel sees this ram, this vision of this ram. And remember, the ram was not necessarily an actual beast or animal. What it represents is a kingdom, and that kingdom is the Medo-Persian kingdom. It ruled or reigned from about 550 BC all the way up to 330 BC. Now, Daniel says there were these two horns. One horn was longer than the other. Well, the kingdom of the Medo-Persians, there's really two groups of people, the Medes and the Persians. The first group, the Medes, were actually the more powerful of the two entities when they first started. The Medes would be in what is now modern day Iran and in the northern portion of Iran. The Persians, however, became more powerful and more strong than the Medes. And so that speaks of the longer horn. But they worked in collaboration together. And so that is the Medo-Persian Empire. And that's what Daniel is speaking of, or that's the vision that he sees. Now at verse 5, it goes on further. And as I was watching, a male goat appeared from the west, coming across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. The goat had a horn between its eyes. It came toward the ram with the two horns that I had seen standing beside the river, and it ran at it with a savage force. Verse 7, I saw it approaching the ram. It was enraged against it and struck the ram, breaking its two horns. The ram did not have the power to withstand it. It threw the ram to the ground, trampled upon it, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from its presence. And then the male goat grew exceedingly great. Once again, let me stop here. And so there was this ram, which again corresponds with the Medo-Persians. But then there's this goat that comes on the scene. And this goat is running at such a pace that its feet literally are not touching the ground. It is running with such a quick pace. It is spreading across the land quickly, but it is savage and it is forceful. Well, that kingdom that Daniel sees in this vision speaks of the Greek kingdom, and specifically of Alexander the Great. That horn that was on the male goat was Alexander the Great. He was powerful. He was the most powerful ruler at that point in time. You know, oftentimes if you're a boxing fan or MMA fan, oftentimes you will hear, when they are announcing, the individual who is the champion, they will say the undisputed, undefeated champion of the world. And then they'll talk about who it is. Well, that was Alexander the Great. If you look back historically at Alexander the Great, he fought in approximately 20 wars or battles, and he was undefeated. He was 20-0. He was the undisputed, undefeated champion of the world. He was the ruler of the world at his time. And so that is what Daniel is referencing. The Greek Empire, and specifically Alexander the Great. But it goes on to say this, but at its height of its power, the great horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 prominent horns. See, historically, Alexander the Great, he died at a very young age. He was about 32, 33 years of age. But he had 4 generals that were underneath him. And so his kingdom was broken up amongst those 4 generals. There was Ptolemy, who ruled in Egypt, Antipater / Cassander. So Antipater was the father, Cassander was his son, but they ruled a section. Then there was Seleucus, who ruled in Mesopotamia, and then finally Antigonus, who ruled in Macedon. Those were the 4 rulers who came up under Alexander the Great. And again, that is who Daniel is referencing. And so they came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Verse 9, out of one of them came another horn, a little one, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew as high as the host of heaven. It threw down to the earth some of the host and some of the stars, and trampled on them. Verse 11, even against the prince of the host, it acted arrogantly. It took the regular burnt offering away from him and overthrew the place of his sanctuary. And because of his wickedness, the host was given over to it together with the burnt or regular burnt offerings. It cast truth to the ground and kept prospering in what it did. Now, the last portion that we just read, verses 9 through 12, it speaks of this individual. His name was Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes was part of the Seleucid dynasty. Again, one of those 4 generals that came from Alexander the Great and his kingdom. Well, Antiochus came from the Seleucid dynasty. And Antiochus Epiphanes ruled in parts of Egypt, but then the beautiful land or the Holy Land, that was his territory. That was his responsibility. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes was a vile individual. He was also very, very arrogant. He actually gave himself that name Epiphanes. It actually means the illustrious. That's how much he thought of himself. He thought he was the stuff, that he was illustrious, that he was great. And so Antiochus ruled in the Jewish land. But he also, not just being vile, he hated the Jews. He hated their worship of God. He actually thought himself to be God. And so he wanted the Jewish people to actually worship him. He desired to make his own worship universal. And so that was an issue for the Jews because they were going to worship whom? For us, there is but one God and one God alone. That was who they were going to worship. And so Antiochus Epiphanes put them in a place of conflict. But he would also do this. He would put many of the Jews to death, and he would do it in the most cruel and vile ways. He would force the Jews to profane the Sabbath, to eat idol food that was sacrificed to idols. He would abolish the daily sacrifices. He introduced the worship of Zeus, which was a Greek god. But it culminated in this, that one day he went into the temple, he took an actual pig, and he sacrificed the pig on the altar of incense in the temple, thus desecrating the temple. See, pigs were animals that were unclean in Jewish culture. And so not only did he just take an unclean animal into the temple, but then he sacrificed that unclean animal in the temple. And so the Jews were completely upset. They were outraged. I'll talk about that further. But that gives us at least the beginning of what the vision that Daniel had. And again, similar to what he experienced in chapter 7, he was terrified of what he was seeing. And so at verse 13, he is trying to get an understanding of what this dream means. And so at verse 13, note what it says. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one that spoke, "For how long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled?" And he answered, this divine being, this individual answered and said, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." And so Daniel sees this heavenly being speaking about what is happening, speaking about this desecration and this rebellion against God. And the heavenly being is saying, how long would it last? How long? And another heavenly being says, 2,300 evenings and mornings. Now, let me kind of set this up a little bit so that we understand what is happening. So there's a little bit of debate, amongst scholars and theologians in regards to what actually does 2,300 evenings and mornings mean. And so there are some individuals who believe that the 2,300 evenings and mornings are actually 24-hour periods. So 2,300 24-hour periods. Well, that would equate out to, if you look at it from a year standpoint, about 6 years. But there are others who would state that actually what it actually means is this, that it's 1,150 evenings and 1,150 mornings, which total 2,300, which would be about half the time, or 3 years. And most scholars, they would point to the latter interpretation, that it's 1,150 evenings, 1,150 mornings, or 3 years. But nevertheless, there is a point in time where this desecration is going to be resolved, that there's going to be this restoration so that the Jews could then go back and continue their worship. And ultimately, this would lead to what is known as the Maccabean revolt against Antiochus and the Seleucids, so that they could then take back the temple, and they could restore the rightful traditions of the Jews of worship and sacrifice. And ultimately, what it points to is this: the cleansing of the temple is the celebration that is still happening today, called Hanukkah. Hanukkah is the celebration of the restoration of the temple so that the people of God could worship him.